Welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of the Humanities, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you here this evening. So I'd say that this plenary plays an important role in the Institute's program for 2014-2015, which has taken as its theme democracy and dissent. Both of these terms, democracy and dissent, are closely related, of course. In the classical liberal sense, representative democracy embodies a kind of culture of dissent insofar as it affords a certain space of freedom for a plurality of ways of living in a manner outlined by J.S. Mill. It is through such a space of freedom that a plurality of ways of life emerge. That is a source of the inherently innovative character of modern life, we could read Mill as suggesting. Similarly, democracy, or what Karl Popper called, in a far from unproblematic way, the open society, was a society in which there prevailed a robust dialectic of what he called conjecture and refutation that was most clearly modeled in the operations of scientific rationality. In both of these entirely moderate, reasonable, we might say, conceptions of representative democracy, conceptions, I might add, that people in this room may or may not share, Canadian democracy, like most democratic systems globally, could be seen or could be said to be in a condition of deep malaise, or to be in a process of failing in their very own terms. Canadian democracy, that is, has become less a culture of dissent, and the state has, through its muzzling of scientists and librarians, severely arrested and reversed any semblance of critical rationality based on robust question and answer. Indeed, the executive has recently shown itself unwilling to countenance questions on the floor of the House of Commons, dealing with the extraordinarily important issue of the nature and duration of the deployment of Canadian military advisors in Iraq. Governments at all levels in this country find themselves in transgression, it seems, of constitutional law. Major aspects of legislation pertaining, for example, to the protection of waterways are buried in massive omnibus budget bills and so forth. So Professor Howard Caygill is a professor of modern European philosophy at the Center for Research in Modern European philosophy, makes sense, Kingston University, London, and was formerly professor of cultural history at Goldsmiths at the University of London. He is the author of The Art of Judgment, a Kant Dictionary, Walter Benjamin, The Color of Experience, Levinas and the Political, and more recently on Resistance, a Philosophy of Defiance, from which he will be, or on which he will be speaking this evening. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Howard Caygill.
Good evening. Thanks, Samir, and everyone involved for giving me the opportunity to speak this evening. I'm speaking to the title, The Capacity to Resist. Oppositional politics of the 21st century increasingly understands itself as a politics of resistance. Spanning such diverse events and movements as the Arab Spring, Stefan Hessel's call to resistance, Entendez-vous, the Indignados in Spain and Mexico, the Anagmatismeni in Greece, Tikhon, the Invisible Committee, Anonymous and the Occupy movements, the Taksim Republic in Istanbul, and most recently the student movements and the Occupy Central in Hong Kong, not to name them all, resistance seems to be announcing itself as the future of oppositional politics. So what I want to try and suggest this evening is that the concept of the capacity to resist in Clausewitz is taking the place of the idea of freedom. The key to this lies in his referring the fundamental predicament of thinking and acting to the modal category of actuality or Wirklichkeit, rather than the more widely preferred category, modal category of possibility or Möglichkeit, so important for the thinkers of freedom. Now, in order to understand the significance of what might seem a minor interpretive choice on Clausewitz's part, it's necessary to look a little more carefully at some of the peculiar properties of the modal categories as they are described in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So they're the fourth of the four groups of categories that are described by Kant in the Transcendental Analytic, following those of quantity, quality, relation. So the first group, the categories of quantity, structure the quantitative aspects of appearances. The second, their qualitative aspects, and the third, their internal relations. So you have a field of appearances which can then be structured quantitatively, qualitatively, and relationally. The fourth, or modal group of categories, have a rather anomalous kind of position with this respect. They differ from the others insofar as they involve the relation between the sum of appearances, that is, all those appearances already sorted according to quantity, quality, and relation, between the sum of appearances and a subject. In short, the modal categories concern the way in which that subject stands with respect to the sum of appearances in general or world. So they're a peculiar kind of relation. They're almost like a special form of category of relation in that they relate appearances as a whole to a subject. And as with the other groups of categories, Kant provides us with three formal options. A subject's relation to the sum of appearances may be understood in terms of the category of possibility, or in terms of the category of necessity, or in terms of the category of actuality, Wirklichkeit. This focus on the relation of the subject to the sum of appearances points to the special character of the fourth group of categories, because they involve the basic predicament of the subject with respect to the world as the sum of appearances. When understood in terms of the modal category of possibility, the subject's relation to appearances may be described as free. The subject confronts the sum of appearances as the realm of possibility, or in the predicament of the free choice between possibilities. On the other hand, the subject who relates to the sum of appearances as the realm of necessity finds itself under law. It cannot freely select between possibilities. The world is completely law-bound, and the subject is bound by a prior necessity, a predicament understood and repulsed by Kant's contemporaries as Spinozist. But the predicament of the subject with respect to the world or sum of appearances for the modal category of actuality is rather more puzzling. And what does it mean for the subject's relation to the sum of appearances to the world to be actual? Now, overwhelmingly, the reading of Kant that begins with some passages in Kant himself and is then developed by Fichte and to varying degrees Schiller and Hegel lends most weight to the modal category of possibility. Thinking and acting depart from the predicament of a relation to the world as the realm of possibilities. The subject is free with respect to possible appearances, and as a consequence, Kantianism, as we've heard intoned monotonously for 2 centuries now, is a philosophy of freedom. The moment of necessity had to wait until the post-war revival of Spinoza and the deeper understanding of what it means for the subject's relation to the world to be necessary. But for the mainstream reading of Kant, we are ultimately free with respect to the sum of appearances. Our relation to them is governed by possibility. Appearances do not have to be or remain as we find them. They're not fixed and necessary, but can be changed by our exercise of freedom. That is, but the other side of their being the realm of possibility. Yet, the modal category of actuality, or Wirklichkeit, can be understood to offer an alternative to this view, or a competing, or maybe even a complementary to this view. One in which the relation of the subject to the world is not founded in possibility and in freedom, but which points to the play of forces and actualities. And it was this that I think was developed by Clausewitz, and that informs his philosophy of war as the fundamental description of the subject's relation to the world or sum of appearances. So for Clausewitz, the world is not the arena of freedom and law, but overwhelmingly the arena of chance and enmity. This is not a world of security. It's not a world in which we can feel at home, but a hostile and alien place. And for Clausewitz, ultimately, the predicament is one of a battlefield. Schiller then makes the portentous step of moving from the state of nature understood as the realm of force, that is, as the world of actuality, to a world understood in terms of possibility and freely self-posited law, the world that he calls the world of the moral human. Again, to cite Schiller again, thus the physical, actual human and the ethical kind of human must be surpassed. If reason surpasses the state of nature, as it necessarily must, when it would take its place, so the physical, actual human gives way to the possible, ethical human. So the existence of society gives way to a possible, if morally necessary, ideal of society. So having a clear renunciation of actuality in favor of a possibility. So here in Schiller we see the almost inconspicuous negotiation of the modal categories of actuality and possibility, moving from the actuality of force and the physical to the possibility of the moral kind of human. And this move would be of crucial significance for the future, not only of Kant's thought, but of political thinking generally, I think. The actuality governed by force, that is the state of nature for Schiller, the world of violence and war, is superseded, is aufgehoben, through the by now familiar dialectical feint of an opening to possibility, freedom, and morality. But this opening to possibility from the realm of actuality cannot be sustained by its own resources, but, as Schiller shows, requires an alliance with necessity. This becomes one of the great kind of problems of political theory, the relationship between freedom and law. What is more, this move from actuality to possibility is not just one possible historical option for Schiller, because this would leave us in a world possibly governed by the modal category of possibility, but it is necessary. Schiller says, freedom must be. So in the third letter, Schiller inquires into this passage then from the actuality to the ethical state understood in terms of possibility, and affirms with little sense of paradox that the Aufhebung of one into the other, the supersession of actuality by possibility, must take place. The ideal of a possible society that emerges here is not just a possibility, but it is morally necessary, to use Schiller's phrase. With Schiller repeatedly underwriting freedom by means of limiting possibility by an appeal to modal necessity. Achieving, in other words, the alliance of freedom and law. So Schiller concludes this negotiation with the invention of the aesthetic state. That's as aesthetic state as aesthetic political state. But the terms he established for moving from actuality and force to freedom and the moral law were difficult to escape, and remain, I think, difficult to escape. Our politics remains largely Schillerian. There would be very few deviations from Schiller's scenario, the movement out of actuality by means of an alliance between freedom and necessity, cloaked in the harmonies of the ascetic. I would like to move quickly back now to Kiesewetta's pupil Clausewitz, and keeping resistance and a capacity to resist at the back of our minds, because Clausewitz makes liberal use of this actus and of Wirklichkeit in the text on war. So Kiesewetta's insistence on the primacy of actuality relegates freedom and possibility to the margins. The actus is not a free act. It's not grounded in possibility. Possibility is grounded in it. This sense of the predicament of actuality preceding the exercise of freedom is taken as axiomatic by Clausewitz. It informs on war, which we might rename the critique of violent reason. For it is not only an original understanding of modern warfare and its limits, but also a significant contribution to the history of post-Kantian philosophy that emphasizes the violent character of this actus. So Clausewitz, following the line of interpretation, and I'm going to say that the theory of resistance is coming out of this, and our understanding, when we say resistance, we're actually doing this. Clausewitz, following the line of interpretation opened by Kiesewetta, remained immune to the temptations of possibility and the primacy of freedom. And this allowed him to maintain an absolute fidelity to the Kantian reluctance to leave the spatio-temporal limits of sense for the realm of reason and its infinite ideas. It also allowed him to propose an explanation for why the limits of sense are so frequently breached, one that differs from Kant's own view of the intrinsic folly of freedom, whose property is to exceed all limits. Now, while Clausewitz's analysis of escalation and the dangers of escalation would become part of popular nuclear culture, it was quickly forgotten that in On War, escalation is Clausewitz's term for the extravagant use of reason. Escalation is thinking or doing the absolute. It explains the passage from the spatio-temporally limited to the absolute, one passing through actuality rather than freedom and possibility. So escalation consists of reciprocal actions that escalate to an absolute and unsustainable extreme. And Clausewitz in On War identified three significant modes of escalation, three reciprocal actions that drive themselves towards the absolute. The first is the tendency of an act of violence directed against an enemy to provoke a response that exceeds the ferocity of the initial act. The second is the impossibility of leaving the enemy undefeated, since this would permit hostilities to reassume. Therefore, the enemy must be absolutely defeated. And the third is escalation of surveillance and the accumulation of the means of violence, the reciprocal effort to know the enemy better than they know you, or the need for absolute knowledge of the enemy. The three escalations produce the ideas of absolute violence, absolute war, absolute mastery, and absolute knowledge. And Clausewitz will resist them all. So the capacity to resist is a resistance of this escalation. I think it's possible to kind of detect kind of three characteristics of the capacity to resist, which appear kind of almost kind of universally in the historic resistances. I mean, the first is a commitment to justice. That's not freedom, but justice. So the kind of movements of resist, part of the capacity, what constitutes the capacity to resist, is this sense of justice. And also, we might be even more specific with that and say it's a sense of injustice, that provokes action. So what we're talking about with this is not a desire for freedom. You can see immediately with that phrase we have a number of problematics. We have a desire for freedom, we have the possibility of realizing freedom through self-legislation. We could run into that whole set of kind of problems. With justice and injustice, we don't. There is, this is one aspect of the capacity to resist. The other is courage. And this is a very important aspect of the capacity to resist. This is courage in the face of chance and, above all, in the face of enmity. And we've got to see something emerging here, which I think is quite different for comfortable moderns, which is that for the life of resistance, or part of the capacity of to resist, consists in living with the conviction that you have an enemy. And I think for, Clausewitz would say, for the victorious don't like to think they have an enemy anymore. It's to live with the sense of the enemy is a position of comfort, but it's a position of comfort that is based on secured violence for Clausewitz. So courage in the face of the enemy. A great example of this is Gandhi, and the concept, the defining concept of the satagrias or satagriya, which is fortitude or courage. It often emerges, with a frequency that's quite extraordinary. Courage emerges kind of stated in a way which suggests that the resistant is already dead. So if you want to resist, you have to be already dead. Your courage has to be such that there's nothing more that can be taken away from you. There's nothing to keep you in life. Satyagraha was that. Huey Newton in Revolutionary Suicide, the Black Panther, kind of theorized this at length and with great eloquence. The student leader in Hong Kong, just 2 or 3 days ago, said, every battle has to be fought as if it is the last battle, as if this is the one in which you're going to die. You already have to give up on life in some sense to resist. So part of that capacity to resist then is kind of fortitude or kind of courage, and the third part of it is kind of prudence. So you can see here we have the 3 cardinal virtues, kind of justice, fortitude, and prudence. But kind of in the third, part of the capacity to resist is the ability of strategic thinking. And this is a kind of thinking which acts, we could say, if you want to be Kantian, acts according to the maxim that your action will preserve or enhance the capacity to resist. And sometimes that entails a form of controlled defeat. Because if the capacity to resist is the important feature, strategic action must be directed towards preserving the capacity to resist. What Gandhi and other theorists of resistance suggest is that resistance, the capacity to resist, has its own duration. This could be something more than several lifetimes. What's important is nevertheless to maintain the capacity to resist. The capacity to resist doesn't want to realize anything. It wants to continue resisting. And I think one of the fine examples of this is the Greenham Common resistance. The Greenham Common women who occupied the entrances to an American nuclear weapons base in Berkshire in England in the 80s and 90s. They decided that this struggle had to continue until the Americans left. And in their case, this took 25 years. So the occupation with daily evictions, nevertheless continued for 25 years. This was the longue durée of resistance, particularly peaceful resistance. I mean, can the resistant life be a good life? Well, it seems in many of the testimonies of kind of historic resistance and contemporary resistance that this is the good life. So many French resistants in their memoirs, they're unanimous in claiming that they only lived during the resistance. After the resistance, their life, they did not live anymore. This was existence. But on the other hand, maybe that is not a kind of form of life that is available to everybody. That living in extreme insecurity, driven by a sense of injustice, a strong sense of enmity, being always kind of prudent, is that available for every every subject? So I think just now, to finally kind of sum up, the important thing I think in all this is when we try to understand the contemporary movements of resistance, when we try to understand what it means to claim that oppositional politics is resistant, the best way of making resistance comprehensible is to use the concept of the capacity to resist, developed by Clausewitz, out of his kind of reading of Kant. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hello, are you Mr. British Columbia?
Yes, I am.
Did you order some democracy pizza?
Yes, I did.
Well, we've got 3 types here for you.
All right.
This one is called representative democracy.
Oh, that's a 200-year-old.
First past the poll.
First, yeah, that's an
What do you
old kind of
think?
representation.
What do you think?
Yes, it smells old.
Old, okay. Well, let's try this one. This representative democracy, but it's proportional democracy. Now,
Yes, that's-
in 2005, 57% of your neighbors wanted this kind of pizza.
Well, that empowers the parties. I want
it
to
does.
empower myself, the individual.
Well, the radio said just a couple weeks ago, 67% of your neighbors wanted this kind. It looks good to me.
Yeah,
Looks
yes.
good.
Well, it's better than.
We've got one
Some
more
more
kind here. Now,
ones.
this is very new. Very
Yes.
tasty, I've heard. Now, this is called direct democracy pizza.
I like that.
In 1991, 83% of your neighbors
Yes.
wanted this. Let's see. That smells good. Okay, well, what kind would you like? Either proportional or direct democracy?
I like direct democracy. Why
All
would I
right.
give my power to somebody else to represent me when I can represent myself?
Smells good. Okay, well,
Direct
enjoy.
democracy. Thank you.
Enjoy your direct democracy.
Yummy.